This lesson will focus on iteration statements. Now, the Microsoft documentation does a good job of explaining what this is. So you can see iteration statements, core statements, or compound statements to be executed 0 or more times, depending on some loop termination criteria. So as I mentioned, compound statements is basically just like a code block that contains one or more statements. So again, when these statements are compound statements, they are executed in order, except when either the break statement or the continue statement is encountered. Now we'll explain the break and the continue statements later in the lesson. Now C++ provides 4 iteration statements: the while loop, the do while loop, the for loop, and then the range-based for loop. Okay, so I'll link you to this and we'll start off by discussing the while loop. We'll start with a while loop. Now this will repeatedly execute a compound statement, so a block of code with one or more statements in that, okay, as long as some Boolean expression evaluates to true. Now as soon as the Boolean expression evaluates to false, then repetition will stop. Now it might also be the case that if that Boolean expression is false to begin with, then of course your loop will never execute, or those statements in the loop will never execute. So it's going to test that Boolean expression first, okay? That's the difference between the while loop and the do while loop. Now we'll explain the do while loop in another video in this lesson. So you can see I'm demonstrating this in this image here to the right. Okay, we have while some Boolean expression is true, then execute some statement or some statements, again in a block of code, and then it'll go back and it'll check again. So it'll check that first, okay, that Boolean expression, if that is true, then execute those statements, then it'll go back and check that condition again. Okay, so it'll evaluate the Boolean expression and see if that evaluates to true. If not, then the loop will not execute. Okay, repetition will stop and it's going to execute whatever statements you have following the while loop. So with a while loop, it's important to have a control variable. So there are 3 things to remember with regards to the control variable. You have to initialize the control variable, okay, before you enter the while loop. So that variable needs to be declared and initialized before you go and enter the while loop. And of course, when you reach the while loop, you want to test that control variable. So I'll have some Boolean expression that will determine the values of the control variable for which the loop should repeat. You can also think of this as the amount of times that that loop will repeat. Okay, so you're going to write some expression, let's say, so while x is greater than 5, go and repeat the code block. The code block or compound statement is also often referred to as the body of the loop. Okay, you'll often hear that, the body of the loop, and that simply is also referring to the code block. So different ways of referring to the same thing. But the point is you want to test that control variable is going to be part of that Boolean expression. Then thirdly, you want to change the control variable. So the Boolean expression in the while loop must eventually evaluate to false to break out of that loop or to move on to the statements that follow the while loop. So we want to eventually exit out of that loop. Otherwise, you'll have what is known as an infinite loop. So as a quick demo of the while loop, I'll do something like int I, so I for iterator, since we are doing iterations here, and I want some variable to go into that Boolean expression. Alright, so int I, I'll just set that to 5. Then I'll do the while loop. And so what do we want to do here? Well, I'll do something like this. I'll say the game starts in, and then I'll do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then play or something like that. So I'll go and set that Boolean expression. So while I is greater than 0. Then I'll simply print that out, so the value of I, and then I'll decrement I. So I, okay, I'll use the decrement operator, minus minus, and then I'll do I, and end that off. And down here, okay, something like that. I'll just build and run this. And you can see the game starts in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and play. Okay, easy enough. You can see that we have this here. We have initialized that control variable to 5. And then we test that control variable in these parentheses. So we have the while loop here. I'm just printing this stuff out here. But here we are testing this iterator again, in this case I, which is now the control variable. Here I'm simply printing that out, and here the third thing which is important is we are changing that, okay? Because eventually this needs to be false, otherwise we'll have an infinite loop. Finally, I'd like to show you what an infinite loop would look like. Let's say I have an integer called x, and in this test here, I put x is greater than 0. As you can see, this will always be true. We do not change x, okay? We simply change the variable I. So this loop will continue to repeat. And so we'll print the variable I out, and we'll decrement the variable I as well each time. So let's just control an F5. So build and run that. You can see something like this happens. Okay. So basically that will lock up our program. It's going to keep looping, okay, and do the same thing over and over again. Okay, so not quite done with the while loop. We'll discuss the do while loop, and then we'll kind of compare that to the while loop, and we'll take a look at input validation in an upcoming video. Alright, but I hope this video was useful to you, and I'll see you next time.